Today we are going to do a couple things. We're going to continue on with the stories that we left off last time. Before we get there though, one housekeeping item. I got all of your tests marked up and all of the responses put in the computer, and we'll have grades back to you soon. I have 6 house guests over the weekend, and so I didn't have time. I was cooking for a small army. So I'll have your exams back on Wednesday, but that also means that Wednesday is your absolute drop dead last opportunity to take the exam if you haven't taken it yet. So get with me either immediately after class today or on Monday at the beginning of class to take the exam. But is there anybody here that hasn't taken the exam that needs to and is ready to right now? You can take it now if you need to. You want to take it now? Come on up here and sit in the front. I'll get you an exam. But while you're coming up here and getting set, I want to show you guys a help or a tool that's in your study Bibles. If you've got the most recent edition of the Life Application Study Bible, it's on pages 556 through 559. It's a timeline of the divided kingdom. As I mentioned last time, it can be very confusing switching back and forth and trying to keep up with who's doing what when during the divided kingdom, because the description in 1st and 2nd Kings keeps alternating back and forth between them, and there's just a lot going on. And then alongside all of these kings, you also have the prophets that are speaking during that time, but the books of the prophets are later in your Bible, towards the back part of the Old Testament. And so you've got all these written prophets, but it can be hard to track and to know when they're writing, when they're doing what they're doing. And so on these pages in this study Bible, this 3rd edition of the Life Application Study Bible, you have this timeline. You've got these 2 big red bars, slightly different colored bars that represent the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. And you see a whole bunch of little caret marks or dashes into that timeline to show you when the reigns of various kings are starting and ending. And there's also a little blurb about most of them to tell you approximately when they were ruling, how long they ruled, and if they did something that's especially significant, there'll be a little blurb telling you what that was. And so, for example, the other day, I said that I wanted you to know King Omri for building Samaria, for buying the hill and building the city of Samaria that becomes the capital. Well, if you read the Omri introduction, it's Omri built the capital city of Samaria, had a great military power, but continued to lead Israel into idolatry. And so you get this one-sentence summary of Omri and exactly what I wanted you to remember about him. So it's pretty convenient. There's also you can't see it as much on the first page, but on the second page, you see the line for the Northern Kingdom ends early, but that's because Israel gets destroyed earlier. But then there's also some smaller red bars at the top and the bottom, and those show you the timelines of the lives or activities of the prophets that you'll find later in the Old Testament. And so if you need to know, for example, if you're reading Amos and you want to know when Amos was active and what kinds of things was he writing about, well, there's a little bar right here that has Amos on it, and it shows you what time period Amos was active and when he was writing his prophecies. And so that's that. That's what you got. You need an example? Got writing utensil? So let's pick up then with where we left off on Friday. We had just finished talking about the experience of Elijah at Mount Carmel. We'd gotten to the point where God sends down fire from heaven or a lightning strike from heaven to ignite the altar and to consume the sacrifice. And that was the clear demonstration that God is God, but Baal or Baal is not. And if you missed that lecture, I'm sorry, you should really go back and watch it. There's not too many lectures where I get to talk about penis jokes and urination as part of the lecture, and it's all in the text. Right? So you don't want to miss that one. But it all culminates, it all comes to the climax point is the fire falls on the altar, and God clearly demonstrates God is God. Yahweh is God in Israel, not Baal. Well, the immediate aftermath of that, the immediate aftermath of the fire falling, is that the people recognize that God is God, and they turn and look at all the false prophets, the prophets of Baal, and they decide that they need to go, and are mad and upset at having been misled, and so the people go and attack the prophets of Baal and slaughter them. So the 400 prophets of Baal that show up for the showdown die. And Elijah goes to talk to King Ahab and tell him that he needs to go ahead and start for home because rain is about to come. And this is a big moment, a big deal, because remember, Elijah and Ahab first interact when God sends Elijah to Ahab to tell him that there will be no more rain in Israel until Elijah gives the word, because of the sin of Ahab, because of him continuing to lead the people into idolatry. And so there has been no rain since that day, which was 3 years before this. There's been 3 years of drought in Israel, and now Elijah's saying there's going to be rain. So it's about to start raining after 3 years of drought. And so Elijah says, Ahab, you need to start on home. It's about to rain, and if you don't get started, your chariot is going to get bogged down in the mud. And so Ahab sets off for home, and then Elijah has this kind of panic attack, or this moment of doubt, and he goes and sits and seems to put his head between his knees and just, it's kind of like, God, please don't let me down now. You know, I've given the word like you said. You sent down fire from heaven. Please send the rain. Don't let me down now. And he keeps sending this servant over to check and to look out over the water to see, is the rain actually coming? And he keeps sending him back and back and back. And finally, after the 7th time that he sends him to go and look, the servant comes back and says, Dad, there's a little cloud that's about the size of my hand, but there's something there. And Elijah knows then that God has answered and it's going to rain, even if the cloud looks really small. And so he takes off, and he's re-energized by that, and he takes off running, and he actually runs so fast that despite the fact that Ahab is set off in a chariot pulled by horses and has a head start, Elijah catches up to him and passes him. And so now all of this is all good. The people have figured out, they have been shown clearly that God is God in Israel and not Baal. Rain has come, and so there's water. They can start growing crops again. Ahab is, probably not thrilled with the way everything went, but there's water, there's rain again, and so the drought is over. And so all of that headache is gone. Even Ahab is relatively happy. There's one person, though, that is really, really unhappy, that really isn't okay with the way that all of this has turned out, and that is Jezebel. Ahab's wife Jezebel, that wants to encourage Baal worship in Israel and even wants to suppress or eliminate worship of Yahweh and replace it with Baal worship. She's not happy with the way things turned out on Mount Carmel, and she's really not happy with the death of her 400 prophets that she had groomed up and that she was feeding off of her own table, feeding out of her funds. And so she's livid. She's really ticked off at Elijah, and so she sends a messenger to him with a death threat. Basically, if you better run. If you don't, by this time tomorrow, you're going to be like all those other prophets. My prophets of Baal killed on Mount Carmel. You're going to be right there along with them. And so Elijah believes the threat and is scared, and so he runs. He flees. And he flees for a day. He actually flees and runs out of Israel and into Judah. And then he leaves his servant behind there in Judah. And then he continues to run and flee for another day until he's out in the middle of nowhere, out in the wilderness. And he finds a bush, and he lays down underneath it, totally exhausted and despairing about his chances. In fact, he lays down under this bush and he begins to pray that God will let him die. I'm no good to anybody. It's all over. I'm no better than my ancestors. Just let me die. And then he falls asleep. And then an angel comes and wakes him up and gives him some bread and water, and he eats and drinks, and then he falls back asleep. And then a little while later, the angel wakes him up again and gives him even more bread and water and tells him to get up. He's got a journey ahead. He's got to go and travel to Mount Horeb to speak to God. And so Elijah sets off on a 40-day journey to get to Mount Horeb. Now, just a kind of humorous aside here, Elijah comes to this place exhausted, despairing, ready to die, and he lays down and he goes to sleep, and he's given some bread and some water, and he gets up and he travels for 40 days. So no matter how bad your day is going, don't underestimate the power of a nap and a snack. It really works great for my kids too. Whatever their attitude is, nap and a snack, you can fix it. And so Elijah gets a good sleep in and gets some food and water to refresh him, and then he takes off and travels for 40 days to come to Mount Horeb. And when he gets to Mount Horeb, he finds a cave there, and he goes in and he spends the night in the cave. And the next morning he wakes up, and the word of the Lord comes to him and speaks to him, and God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah says, "The people of Israel have broken your covenant. They have torn down your altars. They have slaughtered all your prophets. I'm the last one left, and now they want to kill me too." And so basically, the situation is desperate. It's bad. I don't know what to do. Help. And so God says, "Go back up to the mouth of the cave and wait there. I'm going to pass by and speak to you." And so Elijah goes up to the mouth of the cave, and there is a really dramatic scene, really dramatic series of things that happens with a kind of a twist ending. And so Elijah's standing there at the mouth of the cave, and he's waiting for God to pass by, and he starts to hear this wind blowing. And the wind very quickly escalates until it's a mind-blowing gust. It's hurricane strength and then some. The wind is blowing so hard, in fact, that as it pushes against the rock faces, some of the stone is broken off. The wind actually shatters or breaks rock. It's blowing so hard. But then the text says, but God was not in the wind. And so the wind passes, and then there's an earthquake. There's this huge, ground-shattering earthquake. The mountain is trembling, and more rocks are tumbling down from the earthquake, but God is not in the earthquake. And then out of somewhere comes this huge fire. It's a wall of fire, or like something like a wildfire, whatever it is. It comes and it passes across the mountain, passes over the mountain, but God is not in the fire. But then, after the wind and after the earthquake and after the fire, there is this gentle whisper, or this still small voice is the older translation. This soft-speaking voice. And God comes to speak to Elijah, and Elijah steps out of the cave to speak to God in this gentle whisper. And so that's kind of the unexpected twist you'd expect, especially after the Mount Carmel lightning comes down or fire comes down from heaven, burns not only the sacrifice and the wood, but chars down the altar and burns out all the water, evaporates out all the water that was there. You would expect after that for the God of the universe to show up in a bit of a show. But sure enough, not in the wind, the mountain breaking wind, not in the earthquake, not in the consuming fire that passes over, but in the gentle whisper. And so God speaks to Elijah, and they start out having basically the same conversation they just had. What are you doing here? I have been faithful to the Lord, but the people of Israel have broken the covenant and torn down the altars and have killed all the prophets. I'm the last one left, and now they want to kill me too. And God's response to Elijah is, again, kind of surprising. There's not a whole lot of just direct comfort offered or encouragement. Basically, God says, go back the way you came and anoint a new king over Aram, which is a neighboring country that has been causing all kinds of issues and will continue. There's going to be several more stories in the next little bit that we'll look at today where the Arameans are a problem for the Israelites. And so go and anoint this new guy as king over Aram, and then anoint Jehu as the new king over Israel. We probably won't get to Jehu's story today. I haven't been able to get there in the other classes, but anoint Jehu to be king over Israel, and then also anoint for yourself a successor, Elisha. Go and anoint Elisha to succeed you. And so it's like, basically, this isn't all over. You still have work to do. There's still a future, and so go anoint the next generation of rulers and prophets. And then, oh, by the way, you're not alone. I have reserved 7,000 for myself in Israel that have never bowed to Baal and never worshipped him. They're still out there. So you aren't alone. Now go and do what I said. And so Elijah takes off and goes to do what he was told and anoint these two new kings, and then to anoint Elisha to be prophet after him. And the anointing of Elisha is kind of interesting. Elisha is apparently a farmer. He's out working in his fields, and he's plowing the land behind several teams of oxen. And Elijah just comes by and takes off his cloak and just tosses it over Elisha's shoulder and then keeps walking. Like he didn't just throw clothing at the guy. And so I got to think, if I was Elisha, I'd be kind of confused. Why is this older guy coming by and giving me clothing? Did I look cold or what? But instead, Elisha goes and immediately drops what he's doing and goes and chases after Elijah and says, "Let me go and tell my family goodbye, and then I'm with you." And so Elijah says, "Go. Do what you must. What's that got to do with me?" And so he takes off and he goes. He tells his family goodbye and where he's going, and then he comes back and he tears apart his plow and builds an altar and puts the plow wood on it as firewood. And then he kills his oxen as a sacrifice and offers his oxen to God, which means that he now no longer has the basic tools that he needs to be a farmer. He's basically burned his bridges. He's cut off his escape. He's all in to be Elijah's protege, or his servant. He's gonna follow Elijah from this point on, and he's taken away his own retreat if he needed it. And so Elijah takes off and goes with Elisha behind him, and we're going to get from this point. After this, we're going to get a series of stories that shows that what God has just told Elijah is fully true. Elijah is not going to be the central figure in the next several chapters. Instead, we're going to see God working through several other, sometimes unnamed, we don't even get a name for them, prophets. God is going to speak to the king and to others through these prophets that are not Elijah. Remember, God has just told Elijah that you are not alone. There are 7,000 in Israel that I have reserved for myself. And so we're going to see the action of at least a few of those 7,000. And so the next story in chapter 20 of 1 Kings, Elijah is off with Elisha doing his thing. And yes, by the way, before I move on, yes, this is confusing. Elijah, Elisha, they sound very similar phonetically. It's even hard to tell the difference between them, and I end up saying the wrong name sometimes. But that's just what it is. I mean, that's their names. I can't change them for you. Elijah and Elisha, know the difference. You got to remember the difference between them. Elijah is the one we've been talking about up to this point, with the being fed by ravens in the ravine, and then the widow at Zarephath, and raising the son back to life after keeping the food coming, the unending flour and oil, and then confronting the prophets on top of Mount Carmel, and then the trip to Mount wherever they just came from, the other mountain, totally blanking on the name despite the fact that I said it 3 times earlier, and had the experience with God with the wind and the fire and the earthquake, all of that's all been Elijah. And then we're going to see stories from Elisha. Elijah's stories are mostly going to be in 1 Kings. Elisha's are going to be mostly in 2 Kings, but that's who they are, and you got to keep separate those names of who they are. But the next couple chapters, starting with chapter 20, we're going to see some stories that aren't about Elijah or Elisha. They're about other prophets. And so there's the king of Aram. We've just talked about Elijah supposed to go and anoint a new king over Aram, over the Arameans. The current king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, is going to attack Samaria, the capital city of Israel. And he surrounds the city and besieges it. And he sends this threatening letter by messenger into King Ahab and says, basically, I'm going to come and I'm going to take the best of your stuff. And not just your stuff, I'm going to take the best of your wives and children to be my slaves. And Ahab is so intimidated by Ben-Hadad and his army being at his gates that he says, okay, what I have is yours, come and take it. Come and take the best of my stuff and my wives and my children. And Ben-Hadad, seeing that King Ahab is folding like a lawn chair, sends back another message, another letter, and says, not only am I going to take the best of your wives and your children and your stuff, I'm going to send my servants in, and they're going to search through all of your palaces and all of your important buildings, and find everything of value and just take it. We're going to take all your stuff. And Ahab says, no, that's too far. We're not doing that. I'll give in to the first demand, but not the second. And so Ben-Hadad sends back another letter. At this point, we're almost in a Donald Trump Twitter war between the rulers of these two countries. And so Ben-Hadad sends back another letter and says, fine, I'm coming in anyway, and by the time, since you won't give it up willingly, by the time I'm done with Samaria, there won't be enough dust left in the city to give each of my men a handful. Basically, we're going to come in, we're going to wipe out your city, we're going to take everything, and by the time I'm done, there won't even be some dust left behind. And then Ahab responds back with what for him was probably a pretty good burn, and says, the one who puts on his armor should not boast like the one who takes it off, which is a way of basically saying the one who's getting ready for battle shouldn't boast like the battle's already over and he's already won. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. So he said, the one who puts on his armor should not boast like the one who takes it off. But Ahab has been just kind of, talking at this point. He doesn't really have a plan. He doesn't have any way to defend against the Arameans. There's hundreds of thousands of Aramean soldiers arrayed against Samaria, and there's a few zeros less Israelites to defend. He has no real chance of winning. But he's refused now to give up everything and to surrender to the Arameans because their demands got really out there. And so God sends a prophet, unnamed, to Ahab, and tells Ahab that God will give him the victory over the Arameans in order to show that God is truly God over Israel and convince Ahab that God is God. And so Ahab says, okay, well, what do we got to do? What's the battle plan? And, God and the battle plans, Battle of Jericho, Gideon, and the 300 out of the 20,000. God always has some interesting battle plans. In this case, God tells the prophet to tell Ahab that he is to send out the junior officers, the officers that haven't been in the army long, the kind of newly minted officers, and they are going to lead the battle and lead out the army, and God will give them the victory over the Arameans. And so Ahab sends out the junior officers in charge of the army, lets them fight it out, and they win. And they not only win, but they're driving off the Arameans, and the Arameans are so stunned by the turn of events that they turn and flee. And then later, they're kind of looking at what happened, and they say, what in the world just happened to us? The Arameans are blown away and confused by the whole thing. How in the world did a few thousand Israelites drive off our army of hundreds of thousands when being led by their most junior green officers? This doesn't make any sense. And finally, one of the advisors comes up to the king and says, what happened was that the God of the Israelites is the God of the hills, and we fought on his home territory in the hills. If we want to win, if we want to defeat the Israelites, we need to fight in the plains where their God has no power. And so build your army back up, man for man, chariot for chariot, just like it was this year. Next year we'll go out again, attack again, but this time we'll draw them out into the plains and fight there, and we'll win for sure. Their God will have no power there. And so the Arameans start building their army back up to attack, and before the next year comes along, God sends another prophet to Ahab and says, here's what they're doing. The Arameans think that I am a God of the hills alone and have no power in the valley. So I'm going to give you the victory again to show them that I am not God of the hills alone, but just God everywhere. And so go, get ready to fight. I'm going to give them into your hands again. And so the Israelites go and fight the Arameans in the plains where they think that they're going to be most able, and their God will help them. And God gives them an astounding victory, and there's like 100,000 casualties on the Aramean side, and the army breaks and they start fleeing. And they flee to some cities, and one of the cities that they flee to, the walls of the city actually collapse in on the army once they're inside, and 20,000 or so more Arameans are killed. And so the Arameans are just having a really, really bad day. Like nothing is going right for them. And in another city, the king of the Arameans, Ben-Hadad, is sealed in. He's inside the city, but the Israelites have surrounded it. He's got basically no chance, no escape. and doesn't know what to do. And so some of his servants go out and sue for peace, beg for terms to surrender and not kill Ben-Hadad. And King Ahab figures out that this is, potentially a money-making opportunity, and so he invites him out, and they negotiate a treaty that involves the Arameans returning a whole bunch of cities and towns that had been captured maybe before, or maybe just being used as a bribe to soften the king up. And then Ben-Hadad also offers Ahab to be able to set up a trading quarter inside of Damascus, to set up a marketplace inside Damascus to sell the goods of the Israelites and make a whole bunch of money that way. And so a whole bunch of free towns and cities and a marketplace in the capital city of the Arameans. This is going to be a whole lot of money rolling in for Ahab, so he's all for it. He's all in. And so Ahab sets Ben-Hadad free on the basis of this treaty. And then God sends another prophet, and this other prophet asks a soldier in the Israelite army to strike him with a sword and cuts him across his head. And then he wraps up his head with a bandage and kind of has it partially obscuring his face so the king won't recognize him. And he sits down on the side of the road and waits for the king to pass by. And this prophet is waiting there. When the king passed by, he calls out to him and he says, "O king," he looks like a wounded soldier on the side of the road. He says, "O king, I was entrusted with a prisoner to watch. And the officer told me that not to let him escape, or it was life for life, my life for his life, if I let him go. But I got so busy with this and that and the other and all these other things that needed doing before the battle or during the battle, and the prisoner got away." And the king says, "Well, you've just pronounced your own sentence. Life for life. You let the prisoner go, your life for his, you die." And the prophet jumps up, pulls off the bandages that are obscuring his face, and says, the king recognizes him, and he says, "You did it. You let the king of Aram go when God had delivered him into your hands. And so now it's your life for his life, your people for his people. You're going to suffer for this." And Ahab goes home in a sulk, mad, pouting. And then we get another story of the next chapter is Ahab still in a sulk, or in a different sulk. This time there is a guy named Naboth who has a vineyard that comes up right up against the property or the palace grounds of Ahab's palace. And Ahab wants to get that vineyard, get that property to grow a vegetable garden because it's right there and convenient to him. But Naboth doesn't want to sell the property or to give it up because it's his ancestral land. His father handed it down to him, his grandfather handed it to his father, and before that, it's been in the family for generations. He doesn't want to give it up so the king can have a convenient vegetable garden. And so he refuses to sell it. Well, Ahab goes home in even more of a sulk, even more angry and sulking and pouting, and he goes a couple of days refusing to eat and just kind of lays in bed and is generally just worthless for a couple of days until his wife Jezebel comes in and says, "What are you doing? Why are you acting like this?" And Ahab explains, "Naboth, vineyard, meanie head won't sell me. What's going on?" And Jezebel says, "Is this how the king of Israel acts? Is this the way the king of Israel is supposed to be? You're the king. If you want it, go take it." And Jezebel says, "Look, I'll get you the vineyard." And so she goes and she starts writing letters and arranging things. And basically what she works out is to declare a fast, a religious fast in Israel, and to have a big gathering as part of that, and to seat Naboth at a place of honor for this fast, in this gathering in this fast, and to put two scoundrels across from him at the table. These two guys are basically men that won't be bothered by lying and saying whatever they're asked to say in exchange for money. And so they arrange all this, and the fast happens, the gathering happens, Naboth is seated, the two scoundrels across from him, and all of a sudden in the middle of this festival or this fast gathering, the two scoundrels jump up and say, "Naboth, he just cursed God and the king. He's speaking blasphemies." And so they accuse him, and since there's two agreeing together, that's a capital offense. And so they drag him out and they stone him to death. And then the word gets back to Jezebel. The messenger sent back to tell Jezebel that Naboth is dead. And so she turns to Ahab and says, "Naboth is dead. Go get your vineyard." And so Ahab heads out to go and claim the vineyard next to the palace grounds and begin planting his vegetable garden. But while he's there, God sends Elijah. Elijah comes back on the scene. God sends Elijah to confront him and tell him basically, because you have done this, because you have murdered Naboth to take his land, you're going to die. And not only are you going to die, but your blood is going to be licked up by dogs in the same place that Naboth's blood was licked up by the dogs. And in ancient Near Eastern society, by the way, dogs were not considered pets. They weren't, lovable, fuzzy, furry creatures that you actually, kept and wanted to be around. They were scavengers. They lived, a lot of dogs lived in cities and would pick through trash and eat things that had been left out, and that was how they survived. They were usually kind of skinny, mangy, ugly-looking things that weren't well regarded. They were treated about like vultures or buzzards out in the country. They were scavengers. They ate things that had been left behind. And so to have his blood licked up by dogs would be very insulting and shameful for the king of Israel, and it would show that people had just kind of abandoned his body somewhere to be scavenged on by dogs. And so Ahab, and then not only that, Elijah tells him, not only is your blood going to be licked up by the dogs in the same place that your enemy, the man that you murdered, is going to be licked up by dogs, but your whole family is going to be killed off, just like the previous dynasties, just like Jeroboam and Baasha before you. Your whole family is going to be killed off because of what you've done, and the kingdom given to somebody else. Jehu. And so when he hears all this, he goes home. Ahab goes home, and he's angry about it, but he's also more chastened this time, and he probably went too far, and he's seen what God has done several times in giving victories and the whole Mount Carmel experience and all of that. And so now God is saying, you're going to die, and your family is going to die with you or die after you. He's chastened by this, and so he goes and prays and humbles himself before the Lord. And so God sends a message back through Elijah and says, look, he's humbled himself, and so the disaster that I have told is going to come on his family won't happen during his lifetime, but during the lifetime of one of his sons. And so he gets a reprieve from the disaster, and it happens under his son instead of under him. And then the next story, the next tale, is the death of Ahab. And we have this guy, Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat is the king of the southern kingdom Israel, or southern kingdom Judah. And you're going to need to know him later, not necessarily right now, but you'll need to know him for the next exam. But he's a king of the southern kingdom that is the first of the kings of the southern kingdom to try to work for peace with Israel instead of conflict. Up until this point, there's been constant raiding and conflict and battles and skirmishes between the northern kingdom Israel and southern kingdom Judah. But Jehoshaphat starts to try to work for peace between them, kind of recognizes that they're separate, they're not coming back, we're not going to be reunifying anytime soon, deal with the situation and have peace between us. And so Jehoshaphat is with Ahab when Ahab is planning a new campaign to attack the Arameans and to take back some territory or something. And he's got all of his advisors around, and he has gathered up this group of prophets that basically tell him whatever he wants to hear. They tell him the news that he wants. And so all of these prophets are gathering around Ahab, and he's asking, should I go to war, or should I go to battle? Should I attack the Arameans? Will God be with me? And all these prophets gathered around him are saying, yes, go, fight, king. God will give you success, and God will give you the victory, and you'll be successful. Go and fight. Jehoshaphat apparently has something between his ears, and so he looks at this group and says, is there a real prophet we can ask? Are there any prophets of the Lord that we can inquire of? And Ahab says, well, there's one guy, his name is Micaiah, but he never has anything good to say about me. And so they send for Micaiah to come and to inquire of the Lord, what should they do? And the servant that goes to get Micaiah says, look, all of the other prophets are saying that the king is going to be victorious, it's all going to be great, just don't rock the boat. Just agree with all the other prophets, agree with what they've said, it'll be great, it'll be fine, just agree with them. And Micaiah, of course, says, I can only say what God tells me to say. And so he goes in, and he comes into the throne room, and he looks, and he sees what's going on, and he looks at Ahab, and he says, go on, king, go fight, God will give you victory. But something about the way he says it, Ahab is real clear that this is not the word from the Lord. I kind of suspect it's like a false cheerleading move. It's like, rah, rah, go king, go, go. But however he says it, Ahab knows this is not really the message. And so he says, how many times have I made you swear to me to only tell me the truth and only tell me what God says? And so Micaiah looks back at him and says, I see Israel scattered on a hill like a sheep without a shepherd, like sheep without a shepherd. The king of Israel is also called the shepherd of Israel because his role is to guide and lead and provide for, to make sure that people are provided for, like a shepherd over sheep. And so when Micaiah says, I see Israel scattered on a hill like sheep without a shepherd, he's basically saying, I see Israel with no king because you're dead. And Ahab turns and looks at Jehoshaphat and says, see, I told you, he never says anything good about me. And Micaiah goes on and gives a little bit more detail to his prophecy, but basically it's, if you go to this battle, you're going to die, and everything that you've already been told is going to happen. And Ahab doesn't really listen to him, but he has a little bit of caution or fear over it, and so he talks Jehoshaphat into going into battle in his full king's regalia and wearing his kingly robes, while Ahab goes into the battle wearing just a standard officer's uniform, basically disguising himself as just a normal officer in the army. And so Ahab has his chariot, but he's disguised as a normal officer, and Jehoshaphat has his chariot. Well, the king of Aram has decided that this is the battle where Ahab dies, and so he has assigned this kind of special forces, his crack charioteers, to go into battle, and he's commanded them, like, don't even engage with anybody else, don't get drawn into any fights with anybody else, find Ahab and kill him. And so this crack group of charioteers comes into the battle, and they see Jehoshaphat as the only one dressed like a king, and so they start chasing him around until they hear him shout out, and they realize that that's not him, that's not Ahab, that's not his voice. And so they break off and go and try to find Ahab somewhere else. Meanwhile, Ahab is just running around the battle in a chariot when some random Aramean soldier draws back and fires a bow into a crowd of Israelites and finds the gap in Ahab's armor. Just randomly shoots into the air and finds the gap in Ahab's armor between the joints, somewhere in the joints between his armor pieces, and pierces deep enough and hits something vital, and Ahab starts to bleed. And he's taken out of the battle, and chariot driver kind of parks on the edge of the battle where Ahab can be propped up to still see the battle, but all the time he's bleeding out into the bottom of this chariot, and the chariot bottom is just filling up with his blood. And by the end of the day, he has bled out so much, he just dies of blood loss. And they take his body back and bury him in Samaria, but then they take the chariot filled with his blood in the bottom to a pool and wash it out. And it turns out that that's the same place that they had taken Naboth and stoned him to death. And dogs come and lick up the king's blood after it's been washed out of the chariot, in the same place where Naboth's blood was licked up, just like the prophets had said. And so that's pretty much the end of Ahab's story. His son becomes king, and then that ends 1 Kings, and we get into 2 Kings, and the first thing in 2 Kings is the son of Ahab dying because he sins, and he doesn't have any children, and so his brother Joram, another of the sons of Ahab, takes over. And also at this point, Elijah is taken up into heaven and leaves Elisha to take his place. And the way that works out is Elijah is going to the place where he knows he's going to be taken up, and Elisha knows that something's going on and that his master isn't going to be with him long, and so Elisha refuses to leave him. And they come to the Jordan River, and Elijah takes off his cloak and smacks the water with it, and they cross the Jordan River on dry ground. The water stops flowing or parts for them, and they'll go across. And when they get to the other side, Elijah looks at Elisha and says, look, you have refused to leave me when I've tried to leave you behind these last several trips, or these last several days. You're still here now. What do you want? What do you want for me to give you? And Elisha says, I want a double portion of your spirit when you go. That whatever it is that God does through you, or the power that you have, that you do all these things, I want that and then some. I want a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah says, well, you're asking for a hard thing, but if you stick with me to the end, you'll have it. And shortly after that, as they're walking down, continuing on, this chariot of fire suddenly comes and swoops down and comes between Elijah and Elisha. Elisha very rationally jumps back to get away from the suddenly appearing chariot of fire. And that separates him from Elijah. And while they're parted, a whirlwind, a tornado comes and snatches Elijah up, and now he's gone. And Elisha is looking around, got to be wide-eyed at this, and says, my father, referring to Elijah, his master. They refer to a well-loved master, sometimes referred to as father. So he says, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. And as he looks, something comes fluttering down out of the sky, and it's Elijah's cloak. Falls down, and Elisha picks it up and takes it with him, and he goes back to the Jordan River, and he smacks the water with the cloak of Elijah, and the water parts, and Elisha walks back through on dry ground. And so we begin to see Elisha taking up his mantle. And what's interesting, Elisha asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. If you look at Elijah's story, there are 7 major miracles or major supernatural events connected with Elijah. 7 things that happen at his word, or because he's there. 7 things. Elisha, there are 14. And so he almost literally gets that double portion that he asked for. It gets doubled. And so the parting of the water, or the river, is the first. The second is very appropriate for today. He is walking along, and there's a group of young men that come out and start mocking him, making fun of him for being bald. Go on, bald head. Get out of here, baldy. And so he calls down curses on them, and a group of she-bears, female bears, come out of the woods and maul them to death, and 42 of the youths die. And so, anybody saw the Oscars or heard the stories today?
Yep.
Yeah. What have you learned? Don't make fun of bald people, or there will be bears or Will Smith, one of the two. And just don't do it. Just love it when things work out to be that way the next day. The bears maul the youths. 42 of them died, and then he rolls on from there, and he's doing other stuff. There's Moab, one of the neighboring nations, revolts against Israel. They've been under oppression from the Israelites, and now that Ahab is dead, they think that they can get out and not pay their tribute anymore. But Joram, the king of Israel, Ahab's successor, doesn't want them out, and so he sends an army after them, goes after them. The army runs into problems, and so they consult Elisha about what to do. God gives them the victory, and the Moabites are suppressed again. And then there's a woman, a widow woman. Think back to Elijah's story. There's a parallel here. I mentioned very briefly the other day a guy named Obadiah. Obadiah was a servant to King Ahab back before Mount Carmel during the drought. And Obadiah was faithful to God, even though he was serving Ahab, and so he hid a whole bunch of the prophets of God in caves and provided food for them during this drought to protect them from Jezebel and Ahab's campaign to wipe out the prophets of God. And so this guy is hiding all these people in these caves, and he's providing them food. And even though he's a high official and employed by King Ahab and had a lot of money, he's feeding hundreds of people during a drought. Food is very expensive when it's scarce. And so he spends through all of his money, and even definitely goes into debt to be able to continue to feed these prophets. And so it's not directly said, but we think that this Obadiah's wife, his widow, is the woman that we're talking about in this story. Obadiah dies and leaves his wife and his sons with the debt that he incurred to provide for the prophets. And now, a few years later, the debtors or the creditors are coming. The people that loaned the money are coming and demanding repayment. And now they said that they're going to take the 2 sons from this widow, take her 2 sons, and take them as slaves in payment for the debt. And she's come to Elisha now looking for help. What can I do? And Elisha knows her story and wants to help her. And so he asks, what do you have? Do you have anything of value? And she says, I've got nothing left. I've sold everything I have. All I've got left is a little jar of oil, a little jar of olive oil. And so Elisha says, go around to all of your neighbors and ask to borrow every pot and every jar you can get your hands on. Don't get just a few. Get all the pots and all the jars you can get your hands on. Take them into your house and close the door and start pouring oil into those pots from your jar. And she agrees, sends out her sons. They borrow every pot they can. They bring them in. They lock the door. And she starts pouring into a jar. And the pouring from her little jar into all these pots and all these jars, it just never stops. It keeps coming and coming and coming until eventually she turns around and says, "Give me another pot." And one of her sons says, "That was the last one. There are no more." And suddenly the oil stops flowing. And so then she comes outside and she looks at Elisha and says, "All right, I've got a lot of olive oil. What now?" And he says, "Go and sell it." Because olive oil was not only, a cooking ingredient as we use it, but it was also what they put in their lamps to burn for light. And so it was a fuel. And so it was kind of like a combination between a cooking oil and gasoline for us. And so it had double uses. It was valuable. And so she could sell it, and she sold off what she had been given with all that excess olive oil, sells it off, and it's enough to pay off the debts and then continue to live on. And so Elisha has a very Elijah-like moment there and provides for this widow. And then there's another woman that she and her husband provide for Elisha and his servant when they're passing through, and they don't have a son, and so they've never had children. And so Elisha prays for them to have children in gratitude for all they've done to support him, and she has a son. And then a few years later, that son has a massive headache one day and then dies. And the woman comes and asks, why did this happen? Why did you give us the hope of a child just to have the child taken away? And so Elisha, like Elijah with the widow at Zarephath, raises the boy from the dead. And then there's the story. There's a couple of other stories. There's a stew pot that has somebody puts poison gourds in it accidentally, and now nobody can eat it. All the prophets are going to go hungry. So Elisha walks by and throws a fistful of flour in, and now suddenly it's all edible. And then there's another story with a group of 100 prophets gathered together, and they've only got like 20 loaves of bread to eat. And Elisha says, "Well, put it out. It'll be enough, and there'll be leftovers." And they eat, and the bread multiplies until it's enough for everybody to eat. Kind of like a New Testament story with Jesus and the 4,000 and then the 5,000. And then there's the last story is the story of Naaman. And Naaman is the commander of the armies of the Arameans. He's the enemy captain of the army. So he's the commander of the enemy armies. And he is struck with leprosy. But his king, the king, he's a very faithful, very good servant. King really wants him to still be around. And he hears that there is a prophet in Israel that can do some really amazing things. And so he sends Naaman with a whole bunch of gifts to the king of Israel to ask for healing. And Naaman shows up at the king's palace and says, "Here I am with all these gifts. Here's a letter." The letter says, "Heal my servant." And the king says, "I can't cure leprosy. What is he sending it to me for? Is he trying to pick another fight? Or are we about to go back to war? Is this his way of picking another war with me?" And Elisha hears what's going on and sends a messenger and says, "Send Naaman to me. I'll take care of it." And so Naaman goes down to Elisha's house. And Elisha doesn't even come outside. He just sends a servant out to go to Naaman and say, "Go and wash yourself in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be cleansed." Naaman is the commander of the armies of an entire nation. He's a fairly important person. He's not used to being just kind of casually dismissed or talked to by servants and not by the man himself. And so he's mad, upset, and he goes from there and he says, I expected that he would at least come out. The man of God would come out and call on the name of his God and wave his hand over the spot, and I would be healed. But go and wash in the Jordan? There are better rivers in Aramea. I'm not going back and washing in the filthy Jordan. And so he turns around to go home when one of his servants comes up and says, "Look, if he had told you to go on some epic quest to fight and to do something very difficult in order to be healed, you've done it without a second thought. How much more should you be willing to just go and wash in the water if he says wash and be cleansed?" And so he gives in and goes and he washes himself in the water, and sure enough, he's healed. And so he comes back and he tries to give gifts to Elisha to say thank you for the healing, but Elisha won't accept anything. And so finally Naaman says, "Well, give me permission to take as much dirt, as much earth as my donkeys can carry back with me, and I'll build an altar, and from now on, I will sacrifice only to the God of Israel, not to any other God." And so he leaves, and that's what he does. There's a little more story attached there, but we're out of time. It's time to get out. So we'll see y'all on Wednesday and pick up and finish out the story of